So kindly turn to Genesis chapter 41. Let me read first few verses. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. Shall we look to the Lord in prayer? Loving Heavenly Father, we say thank you to you for granting us this time to gather together and to study a word, specifically Genesis chapter 41, where we'll be looking at the dreams of Pharaoh, interpretation of Joseph, and the reaction of the Pharaoh to that interpretation. Lord, we pray and thank you for everyone who gathered. Continue to speak to us, open our understanding, guide us and lead us. We ask you to touch each one of us through your Spirit. Committing the study of the word into your hands, we offer this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, before we dwell into this, I'm going to give one reference in the New Testament. I'm reading Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1. Listen to this. God, who at many times and in various manners spoke in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. Hebrews writer has said very clearly how God speaks. Various ways. There is no one method. Take, for example, we have studied in Genesis, Abraham. We do not know how God spoke to him. He called him out of Ur. Now, how did he speak to him? Except in only one place, there are 3 visitors coming. 3 people who look like human beings, men. That's the only time we read about the communication, Abraham and the Lord. Rest of the time, how did God speak to Abraham? Now, we do not know how God spoke to Isaac. We have studied all these things in the book of Genesis. When it comes to Jacob, in Genesis 28, God spoke to him through a dream. You remember the ladders? Angels going up and down? And we also realize the dream getting fulfilled in Jacob's lifetime. And he comes back to the promised land with his family, with the flocks. Now, Jacob, not only he, even Isaac and Abraham, they have a tendency to continue to explain to the children what was happening in their lives. That is how we get all the writings in the Genesis. So Jacob must have explained to all his children about the experience probably of Abraham, Isaac, and himself. So now Joseph, when he comes into the scene, God speaks to Joseph by 2 dreams. We have seen that. And he runs to his brothers and his parents also. He tells them the dreams. They're wondering what it is. And Joseph also must be thinking about it. But one thing is very clear. The dream shows Joseph in authority. So the brothers are reacting to that kind of a dream. Now, brothers need not have reacted. It's only a dream. Joseph is not making himself authoritative over the brothers. He says, this is what I dreamed. So you see how the reaction of the people, we need to be very careful in our reaction to what happens to others. Somebody may get a promotion and somebody may have some fortune. So how do you react to all these things? We need to be very careful, very careful. Now, revealing the dream to Joseph, God is speaking to Joseph so that Joseph also can prepare himself. When God works in us and through us, he does some part. He also expects us to do our part. Now, in this case, Joseph is supposed to be reaching out to higher levels of authority, where people will be looking at him for guidance. So if you look at the whole scenario, number one, he was one of the shepherd boys, a young boy. His brother was not even born at the time. Then he becomes sold out to the Midianites and the Egyptians. In Pharaoh's house, we have already read that. Remember? Genesis 39 and verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph. When you read that verse, we need to understand the entire Bible. To whom will the Lord dwell? With a man of humble and contrite spirit. That's what Isaiah chapter 57, verse 15 says. So when sold as a slave, Joseph must be thinking of his own dreams. What happens to my dreams? What mistake did I do? But then he comes over his circumstances. He comes over his circumstances. That's very important. Even in the prison, he takes up all the responsibility. He's next to the prison in charge. That's what you find. Same thing happened in Potiphar's house. He was sold as a slave. He come next to Potiphar's house, in charge of all the servants, everything, both in the house and in the field. So we see in Potiphar's house, we see in prison, we already studied. Now he is going to go before Pharaoh himself. Now we need to understand when we talk about Egypt and pharaohs, leave the Bible, go back to history. Historical narratives anywhere in the world as taught to the children speak about empires in the world. There is Roman Empire, some of you would have seen it. Earlier, British Empire. And also we had Assyrian empires, Babylonian empires. Now, if you look at all these empires, we're going to see something. Probably the longest and the greatest is the Egyptian empire. 3,000 years. Without a break, the Egyptian empire lasted. Number one. They have also left a mark in the world, which even today with the technology, we will struggle to build the premise of Egypt. Remember, this is the empire in which Joseph is now finding himself, handling himself, right? He is in the prison in Egypt. Let's move on to Genesis chapter 41. So at the end of 2 full years, he is in the prison. He told the dreams of butler and baker. They come out, they forget him. So another 2 full years have passed. Now Pharaoh dreams. Joseph is in charge of all the prisoners. He's still continuing his work. He's getting trained. Now, if you look at the prison job, you'll know discipline, feeding the prisoners, everything A to Z. He's learning a lot of things in that. Environment may be prison, but the training he gets is the best. So we need to look at it. Our environment might be very different, but God is giving us an opportunity so that we train ourselves for our walk on this earth, and more so for the events to come in the future. What we talk about, the eternity. We need to be trained for that. Let's move on, Genesis chapter 41. What is a dream? 2 dreams. Verse 2. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored cows and fat. They fed in a meadow. Behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ill-favored, sin, stood by the other cows upon the bank of the water. So Pharaoh was seeing 2 sets of cows, fat and lean, 7 each. Verse 4. And the ill-favored and thin cows did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. The dream is partly natural, partly unnatural. You can see a fat cow. It's very natural. You can see a ill-favored, lean cows. Very natural. We can see around a lot of them in the world. but you don't see a cow eating another cow. They're all vegetarian, they eat grass. So there is a natural part of this, there is an unnatural part of this. In the revelation given to Pharaoh by a dream by God. Let's move on now. Verse 5. And Pharaoh slept and dreamed in the second time. Behold, 7 years of grain came up on one stalk, full and good. This is very natural. Verse 7. And then 17 years devoured the, verse 6. And behold, 17 years dried by the east wind sprung up after them. That's also we can see. Those who are involved in garden, you can see that sometimes it gives plentiful, sometimes a thin and dried up things come up. What happens? Verse 6, behold, the 17 years dried up by the east wind sprung up after them. Verse 7, and the 17 years devoured the 7 healthy and full years. And the Pharaoh awoke, behold, it was a dream. The plants and the ears of the grain, so let's say wheat or rice grain, eating one another is unnatural. We don't see that. It doesn't happen. The dream contained natural and unnatural events. Pharaoh is troubled by the dreams. So what does he do? Verse 8, it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, all the wise men thereof. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Now mark verse 8. It's not just one day. He's calling all the wise men of the Egypt. So they may be in different towns, not necessarily in the place where Pharaoh's living. Probably majority of them live. So but to gather them takes some time. And when the Pharaoh would have told the dreams or explained to his servants, go, I want the interpretation, the message would be traveling across the land of Egypt. People will be talking about it. Hey, something happened. Pharaoh is troubled. What is it? So, verse 8 talks about the period of time. It didn't happen overnight that he had a dream, next day he calls everybody. No. I think we need to understand when and how these things happen. So as these people come, what happens? Verse 9. They could, verse 8, none of them could interpret them unto Pharaoh. None of them. That means one by one it's coming, maybe over a period of time. The message is going. Over a period of time, it happens. It is at that point, look at verse 9. Then spoke the chief butler unto the Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my fault this day. Now, this chief butler also didn't think about it, or it didn't strike him. When nobody was able to interpret the dream, suddenly this guy gets this idea. Wait a minute. I know a guy who did it for me. So he goes to Pharaoh because he can approach Pharaoh any day. He is there serving the Pharaoh. So he says that, I remember my fault in verse 9. Let me read verse 10. Pharaoh was angry with his servants, put me in the custody of captain's guard's house, both me and the chief butler. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. There was there a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. We told him, he interpreted our dreams, each man according to his dream, he did interpret. Verse 13, it came to pass as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto my office, and him he hanged. So now the man, the butler, goes to Pharaoh and he says, I just forgot, it's my fault. Explains about Joseph in the prison. Pharaoh is listening. Nobody could interpret. They waited for that. You see, he's a prisoner who, Joseph. How God moves his sleep. Pharaoh would not have called him if he has told him immediately. Think about it. He said, wait a minute, I got my magicians, I got my wise men. Why should I ask a Hebrew fellow that too? He is a prisoner. I'm not interested in that, he will say Pharaoh. But because nobody could interpret, Pharaoh is in a fix. And this man said that a prisoner and a Hebrew is not an Egyptian. Keep that in mind. Okay. At the time when we are talking, Hebrews are despised by the Egyptians because they're shepherds. We need to understand their position, Look down upon. Now, Pharaoh is okay because he has been prepared. His dream is troubling him so much. He is now in a position and willing to call a prisoner, that too a Hebrew. Verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent, called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. He shaved himself, changed clothes, and came into Pharaoh. Now, 14 also, don't jump to conclusion that Pharaoh sends one of his soldiers, he goes and opens the prison door and brings Joseph. No. Pharaoh, you see, they're all organized very well. Extremely organized empire. As I told you, 3,000 years they ruled. Pharaoh would have told his chief, the next to him, I get this man out. Okay, tell me when he's ready. That's all. It passes some days. Each man checks up, where is this man, which prison? They go, open it up, tell him, look, you have to stand before the Pharaoh. They will prepare Joseph to stand before the Pharaoh. Don't forget all these things. It's not overnight. It's not immediately comes. So Joseph would not have kept quiet. What's the problem, you ask? They would have told all things. By the time Joseph came out of the dungeon, he would have heard the dreams. He would have had the problem of interpreting the dreams. So Joseph must be now dwelling on the dreams of Pharaoh, even before he came to Pharaoh. So when you read the Bible, go slow and steady, we will understand what each verse speaks. Let's move on. So Joseph is out of the prison and is changing his clothes. Now, wait a minute. You have to dress up Joseph. So cloth has to be brought, tailor has to be gone. Think of all these things. See, before Pharaoh, you can't just stand like that. So a lot of people are working, making Joseph presentable to the Pharaoh. It says in verse 14, Joseph shaved himself. So they get a barber, they get the hairdressing, everything is done. It's not one day. He's now prepared. By the time Joseph gets enough of time to think about what the dream is. Verse 15. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream. There is none that interpret it. I have heard say of you that you can understand a dream and interpret it. So Pharaoh says, this prisoner, a Hebrew, I understand you can interpret dreams. Just what Pharaoh said. Now, look at what Joseph replies. He's already prepared himself. Standing before the Pharaoh, he says, Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Pause for a moment. Joseph is a son of Jacob. They are Hebrews. They were speaking their mother tongue. You have to remember that. Joseph was sold as a slave to the Midianites. They sell him in Egypt. Joseph is there in Potiphar's house. Joseph is there in the prison. He spends quite a number of years. And he learns Egyptian language. He's speaking to Pharaoh, not in Hebrew, but in Egyptian language. Look at that. So we need to understand what has gone through Joseph. He utilized all the facilities made available to him to gather and prepare himself, not dwelling or focusing much on the circumstances in which he was kept. So he's speaking to Pharaoh in the language of the Pharaoh, Egyptian. Verse 16, Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it's not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Bang. Joseph understood very clearly his dreams. He understood the background of his great-grandfathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He never forgot that the lineage and the promises God has been speaking. So it's very clear cut. He says, God shall give Pharaoh an answer. Now look at Pharaoh. He believed in multiple gods. And he was idols. They made idols in Egypt. And even animals were their gods. But Joseph is talking about one God. Verse 17. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, now Pharaoh is explaining the dream to Joseph. In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of a river. See, the clarity, even Pharaoh doesn't shorten his dream. Clear cut, he says, I have a dream, I'm standing at the bank of a river. Behold, there came up out of the river 7 cows, fat and well favored, they fed in the meadow. Behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ill favored, thin. Never saw in all the land of Egypt for the badness. Very, very, very thin cows. Never seen in my own life, but in the dream I'm seeing. And the thin and ill-favored cows did eat up the first 7 fat cows. We have seen the dream. It's now written again in the same chapter. When they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they have eaten them, but they were still ill-favored as at the beginning. So I awake. Verse 21 is now much more clear in the dream. When the ill-favored cow ate the fat cow, still they remained ill-favored and thin cows. Verse 22, I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 years came up on this one stalk, full and good. 7 years withered, thin, dried by the east wind, sprang up after them. The thin years devoured the 7 good years. I told this unto the magicians. There was none that could declare it to me. Joseph is listening. Now, from Pharaoh's own mouth, Pharaoh himself is explaining to him. Joseph listens carefully. Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God showed Pharaoh what he's about to do. Bang. You see, God works in us, in human beings. He reveals it. Sometimes externally comes and reveals, externally comes and talks. Sometimes internally he gives the revelation. We do not know how Joseph got the revelation. Nothing is mentioned. Let's not break up our heads about it. Only thing is true, he understood the revelation clearly. He's saying his dream is one. Both of them is talking about the same. Verse 26, the 7 good cows, 7 years, 7 good years or 7 years. Bad. He interprets first. Both the 7, number 7 is 7 years, whether you look at the cows or the corn, years of the corn, wheat or whatever it is. 7 years is talking about. Verse 27, the 7 thin ill-favored cows that came up after the 7 years, and the 7 empty, dried by the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. So he says 7, 7, 2, 7 years he's talking about. Verse 28. This is the thing that I have spoken to Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he shows to Pharaoh. Behold, there comes 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. 7 years of great plenty. That's the interpretation. Referring to the fat cows and good grains. There shall arise after them 7 years of famine. All the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. Now, he gives clarity of the interpretation of the 7 thin years equivalent to 7 famine, which is going to swallow the good years. Verse 31, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of the famine following, for it shall be very grievous, and for that dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly come to pass. Now, this is another interpretation we need to understand. Jesus, when he spoke in the Gospels, you'll always read, verily, verily, I say unto you. When Jesus said 2 times, verily, verily, he hammers the nail. It's going to happen. It's decided. No reverting back. That's what he says. 2 times when the dream is given, God will not relent. It's going to happen. 1 time, there is a possibility God may relent. There's no question of God relenting on this. That is the interpretation. Joseph normally should have stopped with that. Joseph did not stop with that. This is something we need to suddenly look at that. He explained the dream, interpreted the dream. He didn't stop with that. Look at what Joseph is doing now. Verse 34, let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint officers over the land. Take a fifth part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. What is Joseph telling? Joseph has already worked out a solution to the 7 years of famine. And in the solution is much more specific. To the extent he says 1/5 of the produce in the first 7 years you collect, that's enough to maintain the 7 years of famine. He has done his homework. See, we need to understand all these things have happened in the time he was called out. From the time he heard the Pharaoh's dream and he's getting himself prepared, he has worked on it. He has worked on it. He didn't spend his time just loosely like that. Verse 35, let them gather all the food that the good years come and lay up grain under the hand of Pharaoh. Let them keep food in the cities. He also says that when you gather the grain, keep them in different cities, not in one place. Because so much you have to gather for the entire Egypt. Verse 36, and that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. He gives a solution to the problem that will arise, which has been already revealed to Pharaoh by 2 dreams. Joseph was not asked to do that. He goes the extra mile. We need to understand that there are times we need to take up these extra miles. We need to do that. We can't be just saying, this is all, I'm drawing a line. It's none of my business. No, don't say that. Don't say that this is none of my business. Many people do that, even Christian believers. We need to go the extra mile. Verse 37, now the thing was good in the eyes of the Pharaoh, in the eyes of all his servants. Look, all the servants are listening. They all feel, hey, great, this guy is too good. Pharaoh said unto his servants, can anyone find one man like this, in whom the Spirit of God is? The recognition that Joseph could interpret dreams, Pharaoh is attributing to the Spirit of God, not to the intelligence of Joseph. Mark it. So the behavior of Joseph is such, he is not showing himself to be somebody who is knowledgeable, who could do great things. He's showing himself. He's humble, but it's God who's working in and through him. People are able to recognize that. Very important, a characteristic which we need to develop. Verse 39, Pharaoh said unto Joseph, since God has showed you all this, there is none so discreet and wise as you are. Man who is discreet and wise. Look at the words he's using. You are discreet. We may be wise, but we need to be discreet. You shall be over my house. According to your word, shall all my people be ruled. Only in throne I'll be greater than you. He's putting him next to himself. Remember, there will be some Egyptian next to Pharaoh at that moment. You have to think of that also. Joseph comes over him. Think of the reaction of these people. Now, we find in Joseph's life, they don't react much because Joseph was too good for in any work or anything. Let's see what Joseph does. Let's see that. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, put it on Joseph's hand. He gets a ring from Pharaoh himself. Others may have got it. So the Egyptians know that Pharaoh has already put him in his place. Arrayed him in the clothing of fine linen, put a gold chain about his neck. He made him ride in his second chariot. Nobody would have. The moment Joseph rides the second chariot of Pharaoh, the man who was next to Pharaoh would have understood that Joseph is his boss. And they cried before him, bow the knee. He made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh. Without you shall no man lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Look at the power and authority given to Joseph. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without you no man shall lift his hand. Verse 45, Pharaoh called Joseph's name. He changes the name because it's a Hebrew name. He's giving him a, what is called Egyptian name. Zephanath Paneah. You need to remember, Joseph was not called Joseph in Egypt. People who are trying to look into the records of Egypt to find the name Joseph, they don't find that. You won't find that. He's given an Egyptian, he'll go under Egyptian name. Only in Hebrew records, he'll be known as Joseph. He gave to him wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. There was a priest, he had a daughter. So Pharaoh must have seen, see, when he picks up this girl, she must be a good looking one, definitely. He must ask the people, pick up a girl for him. He gives a wife also. Now, Joseph marries not a Hebrew woman. Keep that in mind. He marries an Egyptian, Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of whom Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. What did Joseph do? He goes and surveys the land. He takes up the job seriously. He doesn't sit in the palace where he has got a house, his wife, and everything. Nothing he bothers. He goes around Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh of Egypt. Joseph went out from presence of Pharaoh, went throughout all the land of Egypt. He was a teenager when he was sold. Probably 10 plus years have passed. He was in Potiphar's house, he was a prisoner, he was trained during the period. Now he has got all authority. 47, and the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth handfuls, he gathered up all the food 7 years, which were in the land of Egypt, laid up the food in the cities, food of the field, which are round about every city, laid up the same. Now, Joseph had to build warehouses to further. He did the job very fast. He has been working. Build warehouses, gathered the food, and stored them up. Joseph gathered grain as a sand of sea very much until he quit numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph, verse 50, were born 2 sons before the years of famine. So when the years were plenty, he got 2 sons, first 7 years. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore unto him. Joseph called the name of the first one Manasseh. For God said, he has made me forget all my toil and my father's house. And the name of the second is called Ephraim. For God caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. He gives the name, Hebrew names, Manasseh and Ephraim. And the 7 years of plenty that was in the land were ended. 7 years of famine came, according to Joseph had said. Famine was in all the lands, but all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, people cried to Pharaoh. Now, in the plentiful time, you must remember that Egyptians had enough of bread and everything. So, when the famine came, first year and second year, they must have, each one had his own enough food stored up and he was managing. But even that went out. There's nothing with the people of Egypt. They now come to Pharaoh and said, we have nothing to eat. So, verse 54, 7 years of famine began to come, according to Joseph had said. The famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famine, people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said unto the Egyptians, go unto Joseph, what he says to do. Famine was over all the face of the earth. Joseph opened all the storehouses. Remember, not one storehouse. All the storehouses sold unto Egyptians. Famine was severe in the land of Egypt. All the countries came into Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because that famine was so severe in all the lands. So that's what we have seen. Then this story is known to us all around and all the way. Now let me pause for a moment, go outside the story. All these biblical records, people, archaeologists were trying to open up. They were doing the archaeology. One of the things, if you read about archaeology, they always thrown a doubt on Joseph in Egypt. They said, we are not finding any evidence or anything anywhere about it. But still they were continuing digging up. Then once they found a stone structure, it is there in Egypt, near Aswan, very clearly marked about the 7 years of famine. Completely given them, only about the famine. Okay, only one they got. Then recently they got one in Saudi Arabia, a tablet exactly depicting what we read just now. It is not written by Hebrews, it is by local people, Arabians. They mention 7 years of plenty. They said we enjoyed it. Then we were hit for 7 years. Nothing. We suffered a lot. It's all mentioned. Exact story of Joseph. Slowly and slowly, we are coming into, even through archaeology, the confirmation that 7 years of plenty and famine recorded in the Bible, which was questioned by many critics, whether it's true or not. We now records coming out here and there, mentioning about this. So these stories are true. So as we read through Joseph and his rise to authority, we should remember everything points to something. Go back to Abraham. What did God say? This is the promised land. But the iniquity of Amorites is not yet full. I'm going to take your people to Egypt, to a foreign land. They will stay there. When the iniquity of Amorites is full, I will bring them back and remove the Amorites. And your descendants will occupy this land. God, in short, few sentences, told Abraham everything. The people going to Egypt, living there, multiplying, and through the hand of Moses coming out, Joshua bringing them into the promised land. Everything, short and sweet, God told it. But it took many years to happen. That's what we are seeing. The revelation of God comes through many ways. We are going to stop at this point. Few more minutes. We already come to almost full time. If you got any query, questions, or comments, feel free to do so. We have finished chapter 41 about Joseph, his dreams, and the rising to power and authority. Time is open for all of you. Feel free to give a comments or questions.